we are looking at a deeply entrenched government that in many ways has sadly injected a vein of intolerance into the famously pluralistic, diverse and tolerant Hindu society, which I think has been quite unfortunate.
So my guest today is the Indian politician and public figure Shashi Tharoor, who as an author is perhaps best known for his best-selling Inglorious Empire. His latest book is about a man he places second only to Mahatma Gandhi, a political leader and pioneer in the fight against caste-based discrimination. The book is titled B.R. Ambedkar, the man who gave hope to India's dispossessed. And my guest hopes that this book will introduce Ambedkar to many readers beyond India's borders. Shashi Tharoor, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you again, Hugo.
It's wonderful for you to come in. Look, B.R. Ambedkar is a household name throughout India, but give us a very quick sketch about why he's such an important figure.
Well, he was a child born into what used to be called an untouchable family, what today we would refer to as a Dalit community. His father was a corporal or a sort of semi-sergeant in the British Army, but just a few years from retirement. When Ambedkar was born, an insignificant child, scrabbling in the dust of a small military cantonment town called Mao, suffered terrible discrimination as a child. I've recounted many anecdotes in the book, a couple that are sort of worth evoking just to give you a sense of the privations that a child like that had to go through. He wasn't allowed to sit at a desk and chair like the other school children in his class. He had to carry a gunny sack with him, put it on the floor and sit on that sack near the door.
He was the only untouchable in his class.
The only untouchable in the classroom. And then he had to take the sack with him because nobody else would touch it. He recounts being thrashed once for having dared to touch the communal tap which provided water for the kids, because he was supposed to wait for somebody who was allowed to touch the tap to open it for him, and he was thirsty. He was a child. Got thrashed for that. There are many other anecdotes well into adulthood that reflect the awful social discrimination that the stigma of untouchability provided.
While many of our readers will understand what is meant by the caste system, many of our listeners, I should say, I'm sure many won't. Could you give them an idea? I mean, how deep does caste go in India? How deep did it go? What essentially does it mean for people unfamiliar?
It was pretty deep by that time. It's a system that in some ways was sanctioned by some of the religious texts going back a couple of thousand years. And at the same time, it really was a social practice much more than religious doctrine. There's enough in the Hindu faith to suggest that untouchability and the caste system as a whole are reprehensible because all of us in Hindu philosophy share the same soul. But the truth is that it was being practiced and being practiced in this brutal way. Now, there were people who looked beyond issues of caste, and Ambedkar was somebody who just used his hard work, diligence, and study to rise above the circumstances that his family endured. He won a scholarship to go to college. He was the first person from his community even to graduate from the Elphinstone High School in Bombay. Then he went to college, and then he got a scholarship to go and pursue graduate studies at Columbia University from a kindly Maharaja. And that, you can imagine, was quite a remarkable thing. He went there and came into his own as a public intellectual, and first of all as a private intellectual, just studied enormously, took far more courses than he was required to for his degree in a far wider variety of subjects, soaked them all in, impressed a number of the eminent senior professors there, Edward Seligman, John Dewey, household names in the academic community, were very impressed with this young man, became an economist of no small renown, an authority on provincial taxation in British India and the British manipulation of Indian currency and the problems of the Indian rupee, all of which he was very quickly the leading authority on. He also did a pioneering study of the caste system. He was not studying sociology, he was studying economics, but he did a paper for a conference of the sociology department and impressed all and sundry with his insights. So he was a man of absolutely fertile intellect with a prodigious capacity for hard work. Turned out all of this. As a young man, when he returned to India, he was called upon to testify before various British inquiry commissions looking into issues of representation for all communities in India. And though initially his efforts to get his community, which the British used to call the depressed classes, more of a voice, didn't initially work. By the 1930s, when he came and represented the community at the roundtable conferences convened in London to determine the future of India, of British India, he was able to prevail in persuading the British that the depressed classes needed representation of their own. There were incidents. Mahatma Gandhi didn't like the idea that Ambedkar advocated of actually having separate electorates for the Dalits who would vote for Dalit representatives.
Separate electorates?
Yes. Well, the British had already created those for Muslims.
Right.
So he said, why not for my community too? Gandhi said, this is wrong. You're dividing the Hindus. With this, he went on a hunger strike unto death, and Ambedkar then concluded what was known as the Pune Pact, by which seats were reserved for the Dalits, but they would all be elected by the general Hindu electorate.
To what extent was he opposed in his attempts to improve the status and standing of the untouchable caste?
I think
where did the opposition come from?
His objectives were not opposed, at least not publicly, because both the Hindu orthodoxy and the sort of progressive Congress reformers led by Mahatma Gandhi disdained untouchability. Mm-hmm. But I think where he encountered opposition was in his tactics, as well as the vehemence with which he pursued some of his objectives. Again, Mahatma Gandhi was fairly understanding. He said, look, it's given what he's undergone, it's a miracle he doesn't want to break our heads. And indeed, Ambedkar was no revolutionary. He believed in the power of change through law. And one area in which he was strongly opposed is he did not join the nationalist movement led by the Congress Party. Though he stood for India's freedom, he asked the question, freedom for whom? It can't just be the freedom for the upper caste and the privileged. We have to have social reform first. And he said he will collaborate with the British if by so doing he can win better conditions for his people. Mm-hmm. And so he served in the British, the Viceroy's Executive Council, even during World War II, when Indian leaders were jailed for their protests against the continuation of British rule. Nonetheless, when independence came, he was made law minister in India's first cabinet, and most significantly, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly that produced India's constitution. That was a major contribution, because his imprint can be found in crucial ways in the document by which we all live 75 years later.
For those still struggling with the concept of caste, would you liken it more to a sort of socioeconomic discrimination, or is it more akin to a kind of racism?
Well, it's not racism in the sense that it's not visible. The people from the untouchable community...
What are the signifiers if it's not visible?
Unfortunately, the nasty thing about this is the only signifier is your birth in that community. So in the old traditional villages, everyone knew who everyone was, where they were born, where they lived, gave away who they were. The professions that they were expected to participate in were linked to their castes as well. And marriage and so on, I mean, there's practically no intermarriage across caste lines, and not just with the Dalits, but even across caste lines amongst the more privileged castes. It became a sort of endogamous entity. And the worst discrimination, however, was reserved for the untouchables. They performed the most menial tasks. They were the manual scavengers, the people who had to clean the toilets, sweep the yards, do the sort of unpleasant work that others were not prepared to do. And some of this still continues. A disproportionate number of sanitation workers, even in today's India, would come from that community. And this is something that Ambedkar was revolted by. He wrote, and he never delivered, in the end, a very famous speech which he published as a book called The Annihilation of Caste, where he said that ultimately the only solution was to annihilate the institution itself. Needless to say, that raised some profound questions, because many Hindus felt that a system that had existed for so long had its uses, though discrimination should be outlawed. And indeed, the Constitution of India that Ambedkar had such a major imprint in outlaws untouchability, outlaws caste discrimination, and introduces the world's first and farthest reaching affirmative action program. Because you actually have reserved not just guaranteed opportunities, but guaranteed outcomes for the Dalit community and the Aboriginal people.
With your book, you clearly hope to bring him to wider attention outside of India, around the world. What is your primary reason for doing that? Is it simply because you think he's fascinating? Is it because you think he deserves it on a moral level, or is it because you think it will tell people more about India today?
Well, all three of those and more, because in fact, the amazing thing is it is now estimated there are more statues to Ambedkar than any other man alive in India. I mean,
Really?
not alive or dead in India. Perhaps with the possible exception of Mahatma Gandhi, though even that, you can't really go to every village and count every bust. But that's how much his stature has grown since his death. And it's quite remarkable because when he died, he was still a fairly controversial figure who'd lost more elections than he'd won. But by the time I began writing the book, he died at the age of 65, and I began 65 years later. I would say that his stature had grown enormously. 2 television channels in India conducted a poll in 2011 for the greatest Indian of all time. And it was won by Dr. Ambedkar. So this is the kind of stature he has. Every political party, including those he despised and those who opposed him, clamor to appropriate his legacy, his thoughts, his image, his values. He is almost beyond criticism today in ways that not a single one of his contemporaries are. I mean, even Mahatma Gandhi has his detractors. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, who was prime minister for 17 years, still has his detractors, though in many ways he laid the foundations of the India that Ambedkar had helped conceptualize. Ambedkar is the man who died first. He died in 1956. But I will say that that stature is worth bringing to the attention of people. I mean, why is it that outside India, he's so little known? By the way, that too is changing. The diaspora has taken the message of Ambedkar. There's a memorial here in London, Ambedkar House, up just beyond Chalk Farm, and they've done a marvelous job. He was a lodger in that house.
Right.
Probably had one little room, and now the entire house has been converted into a memorial for him, quite remarkably, and lovingly curated and looked after. I was there on Sunday.
So the word is spreading.
The word is spreading. Many countries are observing anti-discrimination days, equality days, and so on, in celebration of Ambedkar's message, usually on or around his birthday. So there's something. I mean, it's happening in Caribbean countries. There are observances in the UK as well and elsewhere. I think that his stature will only continue to grow internationally, and I wouldn't mind if this book were a small contribution to that.
Understood. Look, when we spoke in this program previously in 2021 about your book, The Struggle for India's Soul, which was about the impact of Hindu nationalism on democracy in India, especially as personified by Prime Minister Modi. Well, since we spoke 2 years ago, are you more or less optimistic about democracy in India? Because you were not wildly optimistic then.
Well, India is a democracy, and that there are going to be free elections is beyond dispute. Next year is when the general elections are due, sometime before May 24. The Mr. Modi, as in your system here, has the right to advance them, and he may well have reasons to advance them to this winter. But having said that, what worries me is the quality of our democracy between elections. We've witnessed, as I discussed with you some years ago, a severe erosion in the autonomy of our institutions, in the quality of our free press, in the independence of the Election Commission, the Judiciary, the Information Commission, a number of institutions which traditionally have stood as bulwarks against the state, occasionally show signs of caving into intimidation or pressure. There's been a rampant misuse of the tax authorities, investigative agencies to harass critics of the government, that sort of thing. The Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden dubbed us somewhat painfully an electoral autocracy. That is, we elect people freely, but once they come to power, they conduct themselves autocratically. That's not a healthy thing to see happening. So many of us, of course, are using the freedoms available to us to speak out against this, particularly within the Indian context. But this book is not so much about that, except that the kind of warnings that Ambedkar gave the Indian people seem eerily prescient. Some of his speeches in the late 40s and early 50s, which I've quoted in the book, have resonance even today. Everything from his dislike of hero worship, the bhakti as he called it, the worship of great men, something that he spoke against very strongly and sharply. Given the personality cult around our current Prime Minister, it's rather striking. He also warned against majoritarian rule. He said nothing could be worse for India than Hindu Raj, and we're seeing the rise of Hindu Raj, or Hindutva Raj in any case, under the present dispensation over the last 9 years. So there are warnings in Ambedkar's messages, in his writings, in his speeches, that we would do well to heed even today.
When we spoke last time, much of what you were saying about India was redolent, reminiscent of what was going on in many other countries, in Britain, in America, elsewhere. That feels less true now in other places than it was then.
But it feels very true in Turkey.
Well, yes.
That's a parallel that
this is what I was going to ask.
Talked about earlier. It's quite uncanny. Both of them talk about their humble origins. Both of one sold a forgotten lemonade or whatever. The other one, the Indian one, sold tea at the railway station. They both grew up from hardscrabble origins to demonstrate that they feel they're more authentic representatives of their people than the allegedly rootless cosmopolitans they've displaced. They speak of nationalism, but it's rooted in both cases in a religious communal identity. For Erdogan, Islam; for Modi, Hindutva. And at the same time, there is this this fierce, shall we say, confidence in themselves, in their message, in their ability to appeal to the passions and prejudices of their own people, linked to a very skillful electoral organization in both cases, and a willingness, frankly, to ride roughshod over dissent.
Yeah.
So the parallels are quite remarkable. Mr. Erdogan has now lasted 20 years. Many of us in the opposition would not like to see quite that happen in India, though Mr. Modi started at a slightly older age. But we are looking at a deeply entrenched government that in many ways has sadly injected a vein of intolerance into the famously pluralistic, diverse and tolerant Hindu society, which I think has been quite unfortunate.
Well, to which one can only hope this book will be something of an antidote. Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Hugo.
A real pleasure to speak to you. And the book, B.R. Ambedkar, The Man Who Gave Hope to India's Dispossessed, is out now.